Well, I'm Martin Stepek. I suppose I'm best known for owning and running Stepek along with my brothers and sisters. We were a major electrical retailer, travel agency chain, top 500 Scottish business, pestered people infinitely on television through adverts. But latterly, in the last sort of 6 or 7 years, I've run a charity called the Scottish Family Business Association, which helps the families who own businesses together to understand the dynamics and the relationships, to try and make sure they remain in harmony, because working together as family is quite tortuous and difficult, as we found out in our own family business. So for me, the core of it is about making sure the family remains loving and kind and in harmony, and that the business fits the family's ethos and goals and visions, rather than the other way around. So that's, I guess, what I do most. But I do a variety of other things. I'm a published poet. There's a bilingual volume of poems that I've written about my father's life coming out next month. And I teach something called mindfulness, which is a mental well-being therapy, essentially, for people with depression and anxiety. But it also works with people who don't have any conditions, in terms of enabling them to see their own mind more clearly, more constructively. And if you add compassion into that mix, then I think it leads to people becoming happier, more contented and kinder people. So I do a lot of different things. They're all my hobbies, and I love it to bits. I guess for me, the main message that I wanted to get across to the young people was a message that I would have liked to have heard, when I was 17, 18, which is that, carpe diem, seize the day, not just seize the day, seize the moment. And at every moment you have an opportunity to enrich your own life and enrich other people's lives. But to do that, you need to have a clarity of mind. So in our lives, the way we just happen to be made, both our genes and our culture and our upbringing, all those experiences lead us to have mental habits, some of which are destructive, some of which are very positive. And it's a question of catching the destructive ones and letting them go, not suppressing them, but letting them go. And then from that moment saying, okay, now what can I do right now that's going to make a difference? What's the best solution to whatever situation I'm in right now? And that can be as simple as go and do my homework, or am I going to make a sarcastic response to a friend, or make some petty, catty comment, or not? And then decide, no, I won't do that, I'll do something. Now that to me allows endless amounts of ripples that go out into the world that can make a positive difference to people. And I think those small moment by moment decisions are what can transform people's lives rather than the big stuff. And I think in terms of leadership, that's what you need to remember. It's the living the example. It's what Gandhi said, be the example. And if you can do that in your everyday moment by moment stuff, then if children, the pupils go away only knowing that, then I think that's an enormous treasure to have, an enormously precious thing to have in life. I think to illustrate that, and I shared this with the pupils, my father and his family were taken to Siberia during the Second World War, put in the Gulag, which is the Soviet political prison camps, and they were near starvation for several years. When they were freed, they had to make their own way barefoot with no resources. What's 2,500 miles down to Persia, and they ended up travelling double that because they got lost. But they were on the outskirts of Moscow one time, and it was the dead of winter, and they were stuck in a snowdrift, and they'd been there for hours and hours, and they hadn't eaten for a week, so they were close to starvation. And then a Russian train pulled up right alongside them on the other track, and this was Russians fleeing the Eastern Front, where Germany were invading the Soviet Union by this time. And the Poles all went out en masse begging for food. And my dad, who was 19 at the time, and his sister, who was 16, Zosha, they went out, but they came back with nothing, leaving Danka, the youngest, who was 14, and looking after her mother, because her mother was so ill she couldn't stand by this time. And they were absolutely devastated because they didn't manage to get any food. Then Danka heard a Russian woman shout, "Little girl, Dvochka," from the next carriage, and she was trying to see where this was coming from. And the second time she caught the woman's attention, she saw who it was, and then the woman leaned down, picked up something big, and she threw it straight at Danka. It could have been a rock or anything, you didn't know what it was. So Danka ducked and she caught it, and it was this enormous loaf of bread. And Danka looked up to thank the woman, and she'd already gone back in the carriage. To me, that kept them alive. They lived on that bread for about a week, and it was enough to sustain them to the next place where they could get food. And if they hadn't had that, Dad would have died, my grandmother would have died, the two girls would have died, I wouldn't be here telling the story. And so there's ripples and consequences. And that notion to me is very deep, very personal, very emotional. The kindness of strangers, which you shared with us that some of your pupils were doing for a wee boy. And I think if altruism grows in a person, and especially grows in leaders, I think there's great hope for humanity. And if it doesn't, we're stuck. I've got a volume of poems, bilingual, English-Polish, coming out before Christmas. And it's a kind of cycle of poems about what happened to my father and the Polish people in Eastern Poland, and been commercially published. And one of the poems tells the story of my Aunt Zosha when she was in Kazakhstan with a family, that she'd fallen ill, and by this time they were in the care of Polish troops, but they still couldn't get out of the country, and they were still desperately hungry. So Zosha fell ill, and she had made a friend with a young girl, similar age, 17, 16, called Yanka. And this girl Yanka, when they were given the sort of portions of bread, which was really sort of almost starvation level rations that the Poles could afford to give them, this girl would break her bread, and there's obviously a religious connotation in this, would break the bread and put half of it aside. And Zosha was amazed at this, because she's gulping it all down, there's not enough food for the day. And Zosha said, "How can you do that? How can you put some aside?" And Yanka said, "Well, my mother's dying of starvation in a nearby village. I'm hoping to keep the bread for her, so that, when we are reunited, I can give it and tend to her." Zosha then fell further ill and was in a mud hut that was serving as a wee hospital. And when she came out, after she recovered, Yanka wasn't there, and she had died of hunger. That is emotional. And it turned out that she died of hunger, keeping the bread for her mother. And to me, in the poem, I ended it by saying the breaking of bread is the sacrament of Holy Communion. And it's about life and about sacrifice. And to me, that's one of the most astonishing stories I've ever heard.